Day 1. Radio dead, unit scattered, enemy closing in. Day 2. Wounded, exhausted, hunted like an animal through hostile jungle. Day 3. Dehydrated, hallucinating, but still fighting. Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez wasn't supposed to survive even the first night alone behind enemy lines. The generals who said women couldn't handle combat were about to learn just how wrong they could be. But how does someone survive when rescue isn't coming? What happens when you're alone against an entire enemy force that knows the terrain better than you do? How do you find food, water, and shelter when every step could be your last? And what did Maya discover about herself in those 72 hours that would change military history forever? The helicopter had gone down in the worst possible place, deep in the Kandahar mountains of Afghanistan, in territory controlled by Taliban forces who had been hunting American soldiers for months. Maya's unit had been on a routine patrol when the RPG hit their Black Hawk. The explosion tore through the aircraft like paper, sending it spiraling into a canyon where no rescue team could reach them quickly. When Maya crawled out of the burning wreckage, she was alone. Her sergeant was dead. Her radio operator was dead. Her medic was dead. 7 good soldiers, friends she'd trained with for 2 years, gone in an instant. And somewhere in the darkness above the canyon, she could hear voices, enemy voices searching for survivors. This is where Maya's story really begins, not with the crash, but with the choice she made in that moment. She could surrender and hope for prisoner treatment. She could hide and wait for rescue that might never come. Or she could do something that no military manual had ever prepared her for, survive on her own in hostile territory where capture meant torture and death. Maya chose to fight. For 72 hours, she would wage a one-woman war against impossible odds, using skills no classroom had ever taught her and strength she didn't know she possessed. What she did in those 3 days would become the stuff of military legend. But more than that, it would prove something that generals and politicians had been debating for decades, that courage, intelligence, and determination don't depend on gender. They depend on the size of your heart and the steel in your spine. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories of incredible courage and proving the doubters wrong resonate with you, consider subscribing to Hidden Heroes for more untold stories that will change how you see human potential forever. The Kandahar province of Afghanistan stretched endlessly under the brutal July sun, its rocky terrain broken by deep canyons and sparse vegetation that offered little comfort to anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves lost in its wilderness. This was bandit country, controlled by Taliban forces who knew every cave, every trail, every hiding spot in the unforgiving landscape. It was the last place any American soldier wanted to find themselves alone and outnumbered. Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez had been arguing with her commanding officers about combat deployment for 6 months. At 29, she was a decorated soldier, with 8 years of military service, fluent in Pashto and Dari, with specialized training in wilderness survival and combat medicine. But she was also 5 feet 6 inches and 130 pounds, which in the minds of some senior officers made her unsuitable for frontline combat operations. Rodriguez is an excellent soldier, Colonel Patterson had told the review board just 3 weeks earlier. But we have to be realistic about physical limitations. Women in combat roles create unnecessary complications and potential vulnerabilities. Major Susan Chen, one of only 2 female officers on the base, had defended Maya's record. Sergeant Rodriguez has consistently outperformed her male counterparts in tactical exercises, marksmanship, and survival training. Her linguistic skills alone make her invaluable for operations in this region. But the debate had continued, with Maya caught in the middle, competent enough to be valued, but female enough to be questioned. The patrol that ended in disaster had actually been Maya's last scheduled mission before transfer to a support role that would keep her safely away from direct combat. The irony wasn't lost on her now as she crouched in the shadow of the crashed helicopter, listening to enemy soldiers searching the wreckage above. All those discussions about whether women could handle combat seemed irrelevant when you were alone, wounded, and hunted by people who wanted you dead. Maya's initial assessment of her situation was grimly professional. She had a broken rib, a deep gash on her left arm from the crash, and various cuts and bruises that would slow her down but weren't life-threatening. Her M4 rifle had survived the crash with 2 full magazines, 60 rounds total. Survival kit, a half-empty water bottle, 2 energy bars, and her combat knife. On the positive side, she was alive when she shouldn't be. She was mobile when she could have been crippled, and she had training that might keep her alive long enough for rescue. On the negative side, she was in enemy territory with limited supplies, no communication, and pursuit that would begin as soon as the sun came up. The voices above were getting closer. Maya could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating their search of the crash site. She counted at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more. They would find the bodies of her unit, confirm that Americans had been aboard the helicopter, and begin a systematic hunt for any survivors. Maya made her first critical decision. She couldn't stay near the crash site. Even if rescue teams were already looking for her, they couldn't reach this canyon quickly, and the enemy would control the area long before help arrived. She needed to move, and she needed to move now, while she still had the cover of darkness. Gathering her gear as quietly as possible, Maya began climbing out of the canyon, using a route that would take her away from the enemy search teams. The climb was treacherous in the darkness, made more difficult by her injuries and the weight of her equipment, but she had 2 advantages. Her survival training had included extensive rock climbing, and she was smaller and lighter than most soldiers, able to use handholds and ledges that wouldn't support heavier climbers. It took her 3 hours to climb out of the canyon and put distance between herself and the crash site. By dawn, she was 5 miles away, hidden in a rock formation that provided concealment from air and ground surveillance. From her position, she could see smoke still rising from the helicopter wreck, and she could see enemy vehicles arriving to begin their search. This was when Maya's real test began. She was no longer just a crash survivor. She was now evading capture by forces that would kill her without hesitation. Everything she had learned in survival school, every technique she had practiced in training exercises, would now be tested under conditions where mistakes meant death. Day 1 had officially begun. Maya's survival training had taught her the priorities: shelter, signaling, water, food, in that order. But in this case, the priorities were modified by the fact that she was being actively hunted. Shelter meant concealment. Signaling could wait until she was sure rescue teams were looking for her and enemy forces weren't monitoring communications. Water and food were critical, but not as critical as staying alive long enough to need them. From her hiding spot, Maya could observe enemy search patterns. They were professional, methodical, and thorough. 3 vehicles had arrived at the crash site, and she could see armed men spreading out in organized search teams. They weren't random insurgents. These were trained fighters who understood military tactics and wouldn't be easy to evade. Maya's advantage was that they were searching for a downed helicopter crew, not necessarily a single survivor. Their search patterns were designed for multiple people, probably injured, probably staying together. They wouldn't expect a lone soldier to have traveled as far as she had during the night, and they wouldn't expect that soldier to be capable of the kind of movement she was planning. But Maya's biggest advantage was something her critics had never understood. She was smart, not just intelligent, but tactically smart, with the kind of analytical mind that could assess complex situations and find solutions others might miss. While her pursuers were using brute force and numbers, she was using her head. The first challenge was water. Maya's survival training had covered water procurement in arid environments, but the techniques were time-consuming and would leave traces that trackers could follow. She needed to find a natural water source, and she needed to find it without revealing her location. Studying the terrain from her concealment, Maya identified 3 possible locations where water might be found. A narrow valley about 2 miles north that showed signs of seasonal drainage, a rocky area to the east where morning shadows suggested possible springs, and a depression to the south where vegetation appeared slightly greener than the surrounding area. The decision required balancing distance, concealment, and probability of success. The northern valley offered the best chance of water, but would take her closer to known enemy positions. The eastern springs would be safer, but might not have accessible water. The southern depression was the longest route, but offered the best concealment. Maya chose the southern route. Better to travel farther with safety than to risk capture for a faster solution. Moving during daylight meant moving slowly, carefully, using every bit of cover the terrain provided. Maya's small size became an advantage. She could use concealment that wouldn't hide larger soldiers. Rock formations that would barely cover a 6-foot man provided complete concealment for her. Vegetation that would be inadequate for most soldiers allowed her to remain invisible to distant observers. The movement took 6 hours. 6 hours of crouching and carefully planned dashes between cover points. 6 hours of constant vigilance, listening for helicopters, watching for movement, analyzing every sound and shadow. By mid-afternoon, Maya reached the depression she had spotted from her morning hiding place. Her tactical analysis had been correct. The depression was formed by an underground spring that created a small seepage area where water could be found by digging. The water wasn't barely enough to fill her bottle, but it was clean and would sustain her for another day. More importantly, the area offered excellent concealment and multiple escape routes. Maya decided this would be her base for day one, a place where she could rest, treat her wounds, and plan her next moves. As the sun began to set on her first day alone, Maya allowed herself a moment of honest assessment. She had survived the crash, evaded initial capture, found water, and established a defensible position. But she had also used most of her energy, her injuries were worsening, and she still had no communication with friendly forces. Day one had been about immediate survival. Day two would be about staying alive long enough for rescue. Day three, if she lived that long, would be about getting home. Maya cleaned her wounds as best she could with her limited medical supplies, ate half of one energy bar, and settled in for what she hoped would be a few hours of rest. But even as exhaustion pulled at her, she remained alert to the sounds of the night. Somewhere out there, people were still looking for her, and not all of them wanted her alive. Day two began before dawn with the sound of helicopters. Maya pressed herself deeper into the rocks as 2 aircraft passed overhead, flying search patterns that suggested they knew approximately where she might be. But whose helicopters were they? American rescue teams or enemy forces with better equipment than she had anticipated? The aircraft made 3 passes before moving on, and Maya realized she faced a new complication. She couldn't signal for help without revealing her position to potential enemies, but she also couldn't assume that every search aircraft was hostile. The mathematics of survival had become more complex. Her injuries had stiffened overnight. The broken rib made breathing painful, and the gash on her arm had become infected despite her efforts to keep it clean. Maya was beginning to understand why survival training emphasized that most people don't die from dramatic causes. They die from the accumulation of small problems that become big ones. But Maya had advantages that went beyond her training. She had spent her childhood in rural New Mexico, where her grandfather had taught her traditional survival skills that weren't part of any military manual. She knew how to read animal tracks to find water, how to identify edible plants in desert environments, and how to create tools from natural materials. More importantly, she had something that couldn't be taught: the absolute refusal to give up. Maya had been fighting for respect and recognition her entire military career. She had been told she wasn't strong enough, wasn't tough enough, wasn't suitable for combat roles. Being hunted in Afghanistan wasn't going to be the experience that proved her critics right. Day two's priority was movement. Maya needed to put more distance between herself and the crash site, and she needed to move toward areas where rescue teams might be able to reach her. But she also needed to avoid enemy patrols that were expanding their search perimeter. Maya's analysis of the terrain suggested that enemy forces would concentrate their search in the valleys and easier travel routes. They would assume a survivor would take the path of least resistance, especially if that survivor was injured and trying to conserve energy. Maya decided to do the opposite. She would take the most difficult route, traveling over ridges and through terrain that would be exhausting but unexpected. The decision nearly killed her. The ridge route Maya chose was steeper and more technical than it had appeared from a distance. Her injuries made climbing extremely difficult, and the additional physical stress was draining her energy reserves faster than she had calculated. By midday, she was exhausted, dehydrated, and beginning to question her route selection. That's when she heard the dogs. The sound came from below and behind her, barking that suggested tracking dogs working a scent trail. Maya realized that her enemies had found her trail from the previous day and were following it methodically. The difficult ridge route she had chosen might have been unexpected, but it had also left clear signs of passage that trained trackers could follow. Maya now faced a decision that would determine whether she survived day two. She could continue climbing, hoping to reach the ridgetop before the dogs caught up to her, or she could find a defensive position and prepare to fight. Either choice carried enormous risks, but staying put meant certain capture. Maya chose to climb. The next 4 hours were the most physically demanding of her life. Climbing while injured, dehydrated, and under pressure, Maya pushed her body beyond what she had thought possible. Every step was agony, every handhold was a struggle, but she kept moving upward, driven by the knowledge that the alternative was unthinkable. The dogs were getting closer. Maya could hear their handlers calling to each other, coordinating the pursuit. They were professionals, and they were gaining ground. But Maya had one advantage. She was climbing routes that would be difficult for larger men to follow, especially men carrying the additional weight of weapons and equipment. As the sun began to set on day 2, Maya finally reached the ridgetop. Below her, she could see her pursuers, 6 men with 2 tracking dogs, following her trail but still several hours behind. From her elevated position, she could also see something that gave her hope, lights in the distance that might be an American forward operating base. But the lights were at least 15 miles away, across terrain that would take a full day to traverse under the best conditions. And Maya wasn't operating under the best conditions. She was operating under conditions that were testing the absolute limits of human endurance. Day 2 had been about movement and evasion. Day 3 would be about survival against impossible odds. Maya's condition on the morning of day 3 was critical. She had consumed her last energy bar the previous evening. Her water was nearly gone, and her infected arm wound was causing fever and weakness. More seriously, she was showing early signs of dehydration and heat exhaustion that could impair her judgment and coordination. But Maya was also only 15 miles from potential rescue, 15 miles from safety, from medical treatment, from survival. The question was whether she could cover that distance before her body gave out or her pursuers caught up to her. Maya's military training had included lessons on the psychology of survival, particularly the mental challenges that arise when physical resources are exhausted. She knew that day 3 would be as much a mental challenge as a physical one. Her body was approaching its limits, but her mind needed to remain sharp enough to make the tactical decisions that would keep her alive. The terrain between her position and the distant lights offered both opportunities and dangers. The route included several valleys that would provide concealment but might also contain enemy positions. There were high ridges that would allow her to observe her surroundings, but would also expose her to detection. And there were areas of broken ground that would be difficult to traverse, but might offer the concealment she needed. Maya chose a route that balanced speed, concealment, and energy conservation. She would travel through valleys during early morning when shadows provided the best cover, climb to observation positions during midday when heat would limit enemy activity, and make her final approach during evening when American forces would be most likely to respond to signals. The plan was sound, but Maya's physical condition was deteriorating. By mid-morning, she was experiencing hallucinations, brief episodes where exhaustion and dehydration created false sensory impressions. She saw movement that wasn't there, heard sounds that didn't exist, and occasionally lost track of time and distance. But even in her compromised state, Maya's tactical instincts remained sharp. She recognized the hallucinations for what they were, compensated for them in her decision-making, and continued moving toward her objective. The breakthrough came in the early afternoon when Maya reached a ridge that gave her a clear view of the American base. She could see helicopters, vehicles, and activity that confirmed this was a significant military installation. More importantly, she could see that the base had defensive perimeters and observation posts that might detect her approach if she signaled correctly. Maya faced her final critical decision. She could approach the base directly, risking detection by any enemy forces in the area, but ensuring that American forces would see her. Or she could continue trying to evade detection until she was closer to the perimeter, reducing the risk of enemy interception, but also reducing the chance of successful rescue if her strength gave out. Maya chose the direct approach. Using her survival mirror to reflect sunlight, Maya began signaling toward the American base. The technique was basic but effective. 3 flashes, pause, 3 flashes, pause, 3 flashes. The international distress signal repeated continuously for 20 minutes. The response came faster than she had expected. A helicopter appeared on the horizon, flying directly toward her position, but Maya's relief was tempered by tactical reality. If she could see the helicopter, enemy forces could see it too. Her signal had revealed her position to everyone in the area. What followed was a race against time that tested every skill Maya had developed during her military career. The rescue helicopter was approaching from the east, but enemy forces were also converging on her position from multiple directions. Maya needed to reach an extraction point while avoiding capture by people who were desperate to prevent her rescue. Maya's final run to the extraction zone was a nightmare of exhaustion, pain, and sheer determination. Enemy forces were close enough that she could hear their voices. The helicopter was visible, but still minutes away, and Maya's body was operating on nothing but willpower and training. When the rescue team finally reached her, Maya was unconscious, severely dehydrated, and suffering from infection and exhaustion. But she was alive, and she was free. The woman who wasn't supposed to be capable of handling combat had survived 72 hours alone in enemy territory and lived to tell the story. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez was promoted to Sergeant First Class and awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. More significantly, her survival story became a case study in military training programs and contributed to policy changes regarding women in combat roles. But for Maya, the most important outcome wasn't the medal or the promotion or even the policy changes. It was the knowledge that she had faced the ultimate test of courage and determination and had passed with distinction. The critics who had questioned her toughness and capability had been proven wrong in the most decisive way possible. Colonel Patterson, who had initially opposed Maya's combat deployment, was present at her medal ceremony. In his remarks, he said something that Maya would never forget. Courage isn't determined by your size or your gender. It's determined by the size of your heart and the strength of your will. Sergeant Rodriguez has both in abundance. Maya's story became part of military legend, but more than that, it became proof of something that shouldn't have needed proving, that heroism, determination, and the ability to survive against impossible odds are human qualities, not male qualities. The generals who said women couldn't handle combat had learned something important from a 130-pound sergeant who refused to give up. And in military bases around the world, female soldiers who faced their own critics and doubters had a new answer to questions about their capability. Just ask Maya Rodriguez. She survived 72 hours behind enemy lines, and she did it alone.